Hello, everyone. It's been a while since I've updated this channel. I'm not going to apologize. The pandemic has sucked, and it has drained me of so many motivations to do things. But I do want to thank all of you who have continued to tell me that you like the channel, you like the content that's on here, encourage me to update it. We're going to finally do the next video on the channel, which is one I've been wanting to do for a while, and I've thought about for a while, which is talking about the Powder Mage trilogy and sort of making recommendations for people to read it or listen to it. Because I think this channel previously has inadvertently focused a lot on Brandon Sanderson stuff. Made sense. His new book came out last year, and it's just such a great, he's such a great author to like get people into fantasy. And so we've done a bunch of content excuse me, around that. But I wanted to find a bridge to sort of broaden out on the fantasy book conversation. And I've known for a while that this was the best bridge to do so. And again, the series that I'm going to be talking about is the Powder Mage trilogy. It is written by Brian McClellan. Part of the reason I'm sure, I've talked to him a couple times actually. He's a really nice guy. But I'm sure it's frustrating to him that, of course, people probably lead with this fact, which is that he's a student of Brandon Sanderson, or was a student of Brandon Sanderson. So it's not like he's like the protege of him or anything like that, but I think it's just nice because he's kind of the perfect author to take some folks who, like maybe some of you've read a lot of the Brandon Sanderson stuff over the past year, now you're ready for something else. And I think because he's kind of got that connection, and you see some of, it's not entirely similar writing, but at least the same kind of like foundational principles when it comes to the writing, that I think it's an easy transition for people. This was one of the first series that I read after getting out of the Brandon Sanderson world, the Cosmere world, and it stuck with me. I've read a lot of other stuff, and there's so many people that talk about a lot of other trilogies. When I talk to a lot of fantasy fans, people are familiar with this series. For instance, like Mark is familiar with it, but he's never read it. For whatever reason, I think it's just there's not as much. People are familiar with it, they just haven't dived into it. But I actually think it's a series that has really stuck with me. So what is it? It is Flintlock fantasy. That should be pretty self-explanatory as a concept if you have not heard that term before, but just as a means of explaining, it's less like sword and shield type stuff you might be familiar with classic fantasy, Lord of the Rings type stuff, less bows or whatever. And instead, it's more based around kind of like the early gun type situations, think muskets, for instance. And what's really cool about that is that one of the magic systems is based around gunpowder. So that kind of helps get an idea of how he's able to take what a lot of people normally do in terms of like high fantasy stuff and then bring it over to this kind of era. And I know that this is a good series because I don't normally like this type of stuff. Like I don't tend to think of that era of the world or history or whatever, musket type warfare or whatever is particularly interesting to me. I know it is to others, but for me, it's just never been something that's really drawn me. But this is what's really cool about this series. So the premise of it is basically it starts off with a coup. I'm going to avoid spoilers as best as I can, actually just completely, because I hate spoilers. But it starts off with a coup, and your main characters are Field Marshal Tamas, Inspector Adamant, and then Thomas's son, Taniel Two-Shot. There's some other characters that are also really great, but these are the three folks that are going to be leading you through the very first book, which is called Promise of Blood, and really mostly that whole trilogy. There's some other point of views, but it's really this one. Field Marshal Thomas is just a badass. One of my favorite characters in the Cosmere world is Dalinar, and Thomas is like a very different, in my opinion, take on that kind of like grizzled veteran father who's maybe not always been like the best father. But he's just, I think, one of my favorite characters that I've ever enjoyed in fantasy. He's just such a badass and really cool, and I don't know, I love every moment with him. Then you kind of have his, I don't want to say like a strange son, but like distant son, Taniel Two-Shot, who has gone off to like another war and sort of become like a hero through that, and has now come back at the time shortly after this coup has been conducted. And then you have the third character whose name is Inspector Adamant, who kind of acts as a very different, like the two other characters are very firmly rooted in like military and battle and all that stuff. As Adamant is more kind of more like a Sherlock Holmes-esque character, not in the like high intelligence, whatever. He's more grounded than that, but you're definitely going to get him kind of working on like a mystery type stuff and inspecting and investigating that type of thing. So I think it's pretty cool how these three different characters play out and the sort of the different things that they are doing over the course of it. Let's talk magic systems. So there are really, I guess I would say like two magic systems that are in this. You kind of have the classical like sorcerers can do kind of crazy type stuff. There's a bit of a twist on that. I won't super go into it, but it does some stuff that makes it not seem as though it's just like boring traditional sorcerer stuff. But it is pretty classically rooted in that whole, a sorcerer is a sorcerer. They throw magic and do stuff like that. But as a kind of foil to that, in the story, around the time this has been happening, more and more powder mages are starting to become a thing. It's kind of like a new form of magic where the powder mages can manipulate and do things with gunpowder. And I think what's really cool about this is that it really creates a reason for there to be some pretty big conflict on that. I think mirrors kind of what we tend to think of a lot around the time of like steampunk or like the steam era or whatever, where you started to have like the rise of new technologies, kind of the beginning of this era that we think of historically, where we started to move out of the, knights and kings and all that, and started to move to this era of industry. And so in the same way that you kind of have this, I think, historical, or at least there's kind of a trope around this when we think of, now there's like trains and all that stuff. You kind of see that play out in the magic system here too, where you have these two sides that are interacting with each other. There's a lot of tension there. Part of the reason this book, part of the events in the book occur around that tension. But it's really neat because it just kind of clashes these two eras together in a really interesting way using magic. There's some other like lighter magic in the series, but not really super worth going into. But I think the world is really cool. Speaking of the world, one of the reasons I think I like Powder Mage Trilogy and so many other books that are like this, part of the reason I like Cosmere, is I really love that idea of like ancient mystery in terms of, before there used to be some sort of advanced civilization, either through magic or technology or something, and they've faded, but there's kind of these these elements of them that have persisted, and rumors and stories and artifacts and all that stuff, and Powder Mage definitely has that. I think for me, I really like stories where over the course of the novel or the movie or the show or whatever, you start to really uncover all this stuff. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say like you should not go into the series expecting that like everything will be revealed as to like what happened in the old world or what happened previously or what was the deal, but you definitely get some cool stuff there where there's some of these mysteries and like what's going on behind the scenes, and there's some political sides of it too, which are really quite fun. And yeah, overall, I think that he's done a great job of creating a world here. Now, in terms of tone, this series, I would say, is somewhere in between grimdark, like if you're familiar with the Joe Abercrombie stuff, or obviously Game of Thrones is pretty grimdark. And then you also have, I tend to think of like Brandon Sanderson stuff as feeling a little bit more Marvel-esque. Some people might disagree with me on this, but his stuff is not very dark. Like even characters that have done really bad things are still like really great people. And one of the things that I think Powder Mage does a good job of is sitting somewhere in the middle of that, where you have characters whose motivations are not entirely altruistic, or maybe they are like fairly good characters, but they're still capable of some like pretty strong callousness or whatever. It just kind of allows you to exist in a world where you're not entirely sure where things are going to go or what a character is going to do. Whereas you kind of have the understanding that like nobody's going to do something really terrible in most Brandon Sanderson novels as like the main character. And on the other hand, like terrible things are going to be constantly happening left and right in like a Joe Abercrombie or Game of Thrones or something. So I like that it sits right there in the middle of the tone and fits right there in the middle of the map in terms of tone, because it allows a little bit of flexibility in the presentation. So I think some criticisms of it. This is one of his earlier works, Brian McClellan. It was published in 2013, but since then he's written a ton of other stuff, including a sequel trilogy to this trilogy. But one of the things that I've heard people criticize it for is sort of its portrayal of women. There's not, I don't think, particularly great female characters in this. Obviously, I wish there was more of that in fantasy, like some more wonderful women characters. But I have noticed that I think, for whatever reason, men seem to struggle in their earlier works when it comes to writing this stuff, probably because they just don't have as great of a capacity to expand beyond their personal experiences and perspective. I think he gets a lot better about that in his second trilogy, which I read. So just as a caveat, if that's something that you're worried about or something to be aware of, I think that is a fair criticism of it. But overall, I think it's really a great world that he's built. The trilogy that comes after this that he just wrapped up relatively recently, I want to say like 2020 or 2019, that one is also quite fantastic, and I think does a really good job of expanding the world and exploring beyond it. And he also has a series of short stories and novellas that are also in this world. Other than that, I also I don't know. I should mention that it's narrated by Christian Radska, which is, I think, a fantastic narrator. I really like the narrator if you're trying to do the audiobook versions of this. And with Brian, I don't know. I really appreciate authors who are pretty public and transparent and accessible, and I've had several conversations with him, mostly because he was doing a D&D stream show on Twitch. I think he still is doing some content on Twitch with some other authors, and he also recently this year, this is not a conversation I've had with him, even though I know it's somewhat familiar to the type of work that I do if you follow my video game stuff, but he also now has a series that he does where he interviews other authors called Page Break, which you can go check out. But he's really accessible. You can tweet at him. I just love authors that are, I don't know, more than just a book that gets published every now and then. And he also doesn't tend to have that syndrome that I think some folks get, where they are just really too involved in the fame. So it's just a really nice guy, and that also makes me like reading it, because I just love an accessible author who's great and open with his fans and all that stuff. So highly recommend the series. I think it's a great bridge away from Brandon Sanderson if you've been reading a ton of his stuff. If you've been reading other fantasy and if this is something that sounds cool to you, check it out. Again, I've avoided too many like the plot points, because I tend to find that discovering that stuff is great, but maybe you feel like I should have. I don't know. Give me feedback on this type of video for book recommendation stuff. Other than that, thank you so much again, everyone, for watching the video, and hopefully we'll have more books and more things to talk about in this channel, and it will not be as quiet as it has been. But who knows? Maybe this is the last time you'll see me for another year.